Hello Daily Drafters, and welcome to the continuation of the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Archetype Skeleton set review. Here at Daily Draft, we do things a little differently when it comes to set review season. Rather than give a card-by-card analysis and grade each card individually, here we build what are called Archetype Skeletons, one for each color pair. This isn't a concept that I came up with on my own. In fact, it was a common way to provide set review content before card-by-card reviews became more popular. But here at Daily Draft, we'd like to bring them back as I really do think that they can be a valuable resource for determining what each of the 10 color pairs might look like prior to your first drafts of the set. Now, obviously, we won't get everything correct, and these skeletons should be used for the first few drafts of the set for you. As the format evolves and we learn more about the cards in the set and how they interact with each other, the skeletons will evolve as well. But hopefully, these provide a good baseline for you to begin the format. Before we get into today's skeleton, I'd like to give you a breakdown of exactly how I arrived at what I did when it comes to what quantities of each rarity of card that will be included in each deck. I went ahead and collected data from each of the 46 Crimson Vow drafts on the channel when it comes to how many mythics, rares, uncommons, and commons each deck had, and I took an average for each rarity. That average came out to 2 mythic rares or rares, 5 uncommons, and 16 commons. Those numbers, plus 17 lands, make our 40-card draft deck. In addition, I will allow 4 commons to be a 2-of inclusion if I deem necessary, bringing the total to 8 1-of commons and 4 2-of commons. Don't worry, it'll all make sense as we get going. Lastly, I'd like to give a special shout out and thank you to all those in the subscriber community for choosing to spend a part of your day here with me. And for those of you that aren't subscribed yet, go ahead and click that red subscribe button attached to this video. Remember, it's absolutely free, doesn't cost you a dime, and you'll then be able to stay updated all through preview season and into draft season for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. With that out of the way, let's dive into our skeleton for the day. This video will be finishing up this series with what I think will be one of my favorite decks in the format, green-white, starting with the signpost uncommon, Jukai Naturalist. It is a green and a white. For a 2/2 enchantment creature human monk at uncommon, it has lifelink and it says that enchantment spells you cast cost 1 generic less to cast. So clearly green-white is about enchantments. You know that there are a lot of enchantment creatures running around, as well as sagas which count as enchantments. So Jukai Naturalist here gives us a little bit of a discount on those, and there's a lot of other cards within green-white that will give us enchantment synergies, buffs, and all sorts of things like that. So let's go ahead and dive into the rest of the deck here. Our first 1-drop is Fang of Shigeki, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 enchantment creature snake ninja at common, and it has Death Touch. I've noticed that almost all the green decks I've made in this format so far have had at least a copy of this, maybe excluding one of them, but it's just a gluey piece to this deck. You know, the fact that they made this an enchantment goes a long way in having extra synergies within this format, and I always love when they print 1 mana 1/1 Death Touches. Sometimes we get 2 mana 1/1 Death Touches, but when they print them at common for 1 mana, it really goes a long way in just really like gluing all of the archetypes within the format together, and the fact that this is an enchantment means it fits very well right inside this deck. And the other 1-drop that we're going to have in this deck is Generous Visitor, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 creature spirit at uncommon, and it says that whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. This card is pretty insane. If green-white's really all about enchantments and you can get 10 plus enchantments in your deck, and the fact that there are enchantment creatures running around too means it's not going to be that difficult to get 10 plus, maybe even pushing 15 enchantments in your deck. And when every enchantment that you cast, remind you, this doesn't even have to land. As long as this is on the battlefield, when you cast that enchantment, you get to throw a 1/1 counter around. This is going to go a long way in just like providing tons of value in this deck, and you really love to see when your opponent has to use a 3 or 4 mana removal spell on your 1-drop to make sure you stop getting value from it. So Generous Visitor is going to be a nice early draft pick that can push you in the direction of green-white if you really want to go that route. Moving on to the 2-drops, we have our first rare for the deck, which is Kami of Transience. It is 1 and a green for a 2/2 creature spirit at rare. It has Trample, and it says whenever you cast an enchantment spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Kami of Transience. And at the beginning of each end step, if an enchantment was put into your graveyard from the battlefield this turn, you may return Kami of Transience from your graveyard to your hand. So obviously, tons of enchantment synergies here with this. It's a 2-mana 2/2 trample, which is already just fine. And again, just like Generous Visitor, you don't get to throw the counters around wherever you want with Kami of Transience, but at least they go on top of this, and then it starts to get bigger and bigger, and it sits on the battlefield, and as soon as you trade or they kill it, any other enchantment that's put into your graveyard on that turn can return this to your hand. It's a way to get it back. It just keeps coming back. It's a great rare, and you're going to love to have it in green-white. Next up is Master's Rebuke, which for 1 and a green is an instant at common. It says target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. So these type of effects have ranged from fine to very good in recent sets. I've started this out as at least a copy in every green deck. So it's at the end of the day, it's better than Rabbit Bite, and Rabbit Bite's always been completely fine. You'll notice that Intercessor's Arrest will come up later, and in the enchantment deck, which is this one, I think Arrest is going to be a better removal spell than Rebuke, but I don't think you're going to cut the first copy of Rebuke in any deck, and not even this one. Next up is Michiko's Reign of Truth, which for 1 and a white is an enchantment saga at uncommon, and in Chapter 1 and 2 both say that target creature gets +1/+1 until end of turn for each artifact and or enchantment you control. In Chapter 3 exiles this saga and returns it to the battlefield transformed as Portrait of Michiko, which is a 0/0 enchantment creature human noble, and it gets +1/+1 for each artifact and or enchantment you control. This card is insane in this deck. It's an uncommon, and it's going to play out as a rare pretty easily. So obviously you don't want to play this on 2. But let's say you play this on turn 6 or so when you have like 3 enchantments on the battlefield already. So it's going to give a creature +3/+3 for 2 turns in a row, make combat math a nightmare for them, and it's going to flip into at least a 3/3 or a 4/4, maybe even larger in certain decks. For 2 mana, that is a ton of value, and this should be an absolute reason to push you into this deck if this deck ends up being any good. Next up is Roaring Earth, which for 1 and a green is an enchantment at uncommon, and it says that whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature or vehicle you control. You can also channel it for X and 2 green, where you discard it and put X +1/+1 counters on target land you control. It becomes a 0/0 green spirit creature token with haste, and it's still a land. I've noticed I put this in quite a few green decks. Turns out that having modality in the early game and in the late game is pretty good. I think this is a really good card. If you're able to get this down on turn 2, first off, it counts as an enchantment. So for cards that care about you having them on the battlefield, this will pump that. For cards that care about you casting enchantments, this will pump that. And if you get it early, again, we're starting to throw around counters a lot. So this plus a Jukai Naturalist plus Generous Visitor plus Kami of Transience. You see that, I mean, it's going to be a very powerful deck once it comes together. But the only problem that I've seen so far is that it's happening at a bit higher rarities, uncommons and rares. So the commons haven't supported as much. But with this card, it's a great enchantment early, and if you draw it late, you can just make a decent sized, big spirit land and then just start rumbling with that. It's got good modality. Next up is 2 copies of Spirited Companion, which is 1 and a white for a 1/1 enchantment creature dog at common, and it says whenever a Spirited Companion enters the battlefield, draw a card. This is exactly what this deck is looking for. It's a 2-drop, it's a 1/1, it actually affects the board, it's an enchantment, it cantrips. I mean, this will act as an uncommon in this deck without a doubt, and you'll play as many of these as you can. You'll notice that basically the only deck I haven't included a copy of this in is Red-White, because Red-White seems very streamlined with samurais and warriors and wanting to attack with high-powered creatures. Spirited Companion doesn't fit super well in that plan, but in every other white deck in the format, especially green-white, this card will do work. Next, we have our second rare of the deck, which is Weaver of Harmony, which for 1 and a green is a 2/2 enchantment creature snake druid at rare. It says that other enchantment creatures you control get +1/+1, and you can pay a green and tap it to copy target activated or triggered ability you control from an enchantment source, and you may choose new targets for the copy. This is going to be a little difficult to use, but a couple of things I can already think of using that second ability for is drawing an extra card off of Spirited Companion, getting an extra trigger off of your Saga Chapter 1 and 2, and that's just a couple of things. And with the amount of enchantment creatures we've got in this deck already, the static ability of giving them all +1/+1 is going to go a long way. This is going to be great for this deck. You know, all rares that I choose for any of these decks obviously will. But as far as enchantments and green-white goes, Weaver of Harmony fits in great. Next, we have a copy of Bearer of Memory, which for 2 and a green is a 3/2 enchantment creature human monk at common, and you can pay 5 and a green to put a +1/+1 counter on target enchantment creature, and it gains trample until end of turn. So this isn't great, to be honest. I mean, 6 mana is way too much to be paying for that type of effect. At the end of the day, though, it is a 3 mana 3/2 enchantment. If there's any deck in this entire format that would play a card like this, it would be green-white. And I think you only really want to include this as like your last playable. And if you really have the nuts green-white deck, you probably won't have room for this. But it's really hard for any creature in Limited nowadays to not be playable. And this seems playable, at least in this deck. Next is Careful Cultivation, which for 2 and a green is an enchantment aura at common. It enchants an artifact or a creature. And as long as enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +1/+3 and has reach and can tap to add 2 green mana. You can also channel it for 1 and a green, where you discard it to create a 1/1 green human monk creature token that adds a green mana when you tap it. So I only included 1 copy of this here because I think the power in this card is in its channel ability. The only thing about having this in green-white is that I think instead of like 90-10 using it for channel, in green-white it might be like 70-30 towards using it for channel. I don't know how much I like the actual enchantment here, but the fact that it's basically a 2-mana mana dork that comes with the ability of using it as an enchantment if you wanted to, I think warrants inclusion in this deck. Next is 2 copies of Golden Tail Disciple, which for 2 and a white is a 2/3 enchantment creature fox monk at common, and it has lifelink. Bread and butter common. I think I've actually included this as a 2 of in some other decks here, and this is the deck that it's going to fit the absolute best in. I don't know if you'd play like 4+ like you would with Spirited Companion or something like that, but again, this is an enchantment creature. And it's a 3 mana 2/3, it's got lifelink, it's really got everything this deck is looking for. It's a perfect curve filler right there at common. Next is the card I mentioned earlier, Intercessor's Arrest, which is 2 and a white for an enchantment aura at common. It enchants a permanent, and enchanted permanent can't attack, block, or crew vehicles, and its activated abilities can't be activated unless they are mana abilities. So the reason I chose to include 2 of these instead of 2 Master's Rebukes in this deck, I think is pretty obvious. This is the enchantment-based removal spell. If you put this on a creature, it counts as another thing towards your enchantment, enchantment count. If you cast it, same thing, gives you another enchantment trigger. This is going to be great removal in this deck. I think you'll play as many of these as you can get. And if you get like 4 of these and don't see a Master's Rebuke, I think you'll be totally fine. But if you get 4 Master's Rebuke and don't see any of these, I think you'll notice your deck doesn't do exactly what you want it to do. So definitely be on the lookout for Intercessor's Arrests in green-white. It's going to be a contested card because it's a good card, but you'll need to prioritize it highly in this deck. Our last 3-drop is Season of Renewal, which for 2 and a green is an instant at common. It says choose one or both. Return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand, and return target enchantment card from your graveyard to your hand. So if there's any deck in the entire format that would use this, it'll be this one. This basically reads as 3 mana instant, return 2 creatures from your graveyard to your hand. I mean, imagine returning even 2 Spirited Companions, right? You got a 2-for-1 out of this one. You're going to get a 2-for-1 out of each of those when you cast it. Talk about value, So there's a lot of enchantment creatures that we've already got in this deck. I think if you have room for it and you have a high enough enchantment count already, including a copy of this is going to be totally fine. But just notice that if your enchantment count is a little lower, 9 or lower even, you probably won't have room for this because you're going to have to try to include as many enchantments as you can. So just be on the lookout for your enchantment count when you choose to include Season of Renewal in your deck. Moving on to the 4-drops, we have Geothermal Kami, which for 3 and a green is a 4/3 creature spirit at common. And it says, whenever it enters the battlefield, you may return an enchantment you control to its owner's hand. If you do, you gain 3 life. So I wanted to point this one out because this is the only deck where I think this is really going to be that great unless you're going hard with enchantments in something other than green-white. But it's a 4-mana 4/3, which is, fine, not great. But the things you're going to want to be bouncing are sagas that have already triggered on their second chapter. You're going to be wanting to bounce Spirited Companions, things like that. That you can get some serious value in this format from bouncing something with Geothermal Kami. Again, this is another thing where you'll know when you want to include a copy of this based on enchantment ETBs, or if you have things on the battlefield that say whenever you cast an enchantment, and then you get an extra 3 life out of the deal too. So even if it's just kind of a board stall and you're able to return a cheap enchantment and then just replay it gets you extra 3 life if you have nothing better to do with your mana. If there's a deck in the format that'll use this, it'll be this one. Next is Jukai Preserver, which for 3 and a green is a 3/3 enchantment creature human druid at common. And whenever it enters the battlefield, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. You can also channel it for 2 and a green, where you discard it to put a +1/+1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures you control. So between this deck and the red-green deck, I think this is going to perform as the best green common in the set. And there's a chance that because black-green doesn't really have an identity, this is still just going to be one of the better green commons in black-green. And in blue-green, it's a fine curve filler at the 4-drop slot. So I think this is probably the best green common in the set. Fits in perfectly in this deck. The 1/1 counters are basically just bonus here, and you might have a couple of modified keyword things going on even in green-white. This is an enchantment. It's exactly where we want to be. Next is Sunblade Samurai, which for 4 and a white is a 4/4 enchantment creature human samurai at common. It has vigilance. You can channel it for 2 generic mana, where you discard it, search your library for a basic plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle. You gain 2 life. I've talked about this with every white deck so far in this entire series. It's a 5-mana 4/4 vigilance. Great thing in this deck is it's an enchantment. I think this is going to play pretty similarly to Falkenrath Celebrant in the last format. We looked at that card and we thought it might be a little clunky at 5 mana, but it did a lot of things in that format that were pretty good. It was a 5-mana 4/4 with Menace that created 2 blood. This is a 5-mana 4/4 with Vigilance that is also an enchantment and has a channel ability if you get mana screwed. I think it's just going to be just about as good as that, and in this deck, it might be even a little bit better. Next is Greater Tanuki, which for 4 green is a 6/5 enchantment creature dog at common. It has Trample. It also has Channel for 2 and a green, where you can discard it to search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This is basically the exact same thing as Sunblade Samurai in this deck. I don't know which one's better, but this is also an enchantment for some reason. It has Trample. It has a channel ability if you're getting mana screwed, helps you ramp a little bit. I think you'll know when you want 1 or more copies of this in this deck, and I think the first one's going to be highly coveted. So take a look for Greater Tanukis and Sunblade Samurais in green-white. I think it's going to be the natural top end for this deck. And last but not least, we have Sky Blessed Samurai, which for 6 and a white is a 4/4 enchantment creature human samurai at uncommon, and it costs 1 less to cast for each enchantment you control. It has flying. Just make sure when you put this card in your deck that your enchantment count is high enough. You're going to need 10 plus enchantments to make sure. I think you want to get this down to at most 5 mana before you're happy. 5-mana 4/4 flyer, and anything below that's going to be absolutely great. So this is the green-white enchantments deck, but make sure you have enough enchantments in your deck before you're willing to include a copy of this. If multiple ones of these are floating around the table, it's not a bad idea to include more than one as your top end if you don't find access to Sunblade Samurais and Greater Tanukis, because both of those cards are going to be coveted in really any white or green deck in the format. This is the only deck that's going to be able to take advantage of this one, so make sure you've got enough enchantments so this can get cheap enough to be worth it. This video concludes the Kamigawa Neon Dynasty Archetype Skeleton set review here on the channel. If you haven't seen the videos for any of the other archetypes yet, be sure to head over to the Archetype Skeleton playlist to make sure you catch up. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to share it with a friend or two, as there's a decent chance they might like it as well. If you're already subscribed to the channel, thanks for being here today, and if you're not, go ahead and click that subscribe button to stay on top of preview season and have access to consistent high-quality drafts as soon as the set launches on Arena. Looks like that'll do it for this video, and I'll see you on Monday for your first Neon Dynasty Daily Draft.